And it's now my honor to introduce our commencement speaker, Ken Alterman, a 1981 graduate of our very own School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and the current president of Comedy Central. Kent is responsible for the leadership, strategy, and management of the #1 brand in comedy. Kent oversees the development and production of all original content produced by Comedy Central and has launched an ambitious slate of new series over the past 6 years and some of the most significant voices in comedy today. So please join with me in welcoming Kent Alterman.
I'm so high right now. You know, there was a time where that might not have been a joke. And that time connects me to the University of Oregon. Thank you, President Schill. You know, when they asked me about coming here to do this, they said, you know, we're pretty progressive, as you know. We're kind of open. What would you like to do? And I said, you know what? When would I go? Like, what order would it be? And they said, you'll go last. So I thought, well, I think probably another speech would be good. But they didn't tell me that I would have to follow Alicia. So I guess I'll just have to say that I really preemptively took President Schill's words to heart about failure, and I am here with you now. So bear with me. It is really great to be back in Eugene. I haven't been here in a long time, and you have no idea how gratifying it is to me to see that Taylor's is still serving the needs of students here. I mean, they really went above and beyond. They even opened at 6:30 this morning to help everybody prep. And that is true public service. But I'm trying to get my bearings. You know, I'm curious, are people still going up the McKenzie River to sit naked in the hot springs? Okay, that's reassuring. All right, well, if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering what I'm doing up here right now. And I can only imagine, you know, how many respectable people said no. But then I thought, well, maybe they thought, well, you know, he works for Comedy Central, and he could probably draw on some of the greatest comedic minds, you know, that he works with. And so I did send a draft of this speech to, you know, Amy Schumer and Key and Peele and Abby and Alana and all these incredible people, you know, that I'm so lucky to be able to work with. And, you know, so far I'm still waiting to hear back from any of them. They love me so much. At any rate, do you notice what separates the smart people from people like me is that theirs are all fixed to their heads, but mine isn't. I've never done this before. Anyway, at any rate, we are here on this glorious, what is it, June morning? Inside this enormous basketball arena, protected from that beautiful fresh air outside. when probably every other college and university in the country has already had their commencement exercises. And you graduates are beginning your journey into the world. And you're wondering, is there anything useful that I could tell you right now? And I guess I should say first that I'm wondering the exact same thing. As I look at you, looking at me, with your vacant, in moments hostile stares, something of significance, really hits me. Why did I procrastinate writing this speech? Thank you for your understanding. I take solace in the fact that, as you are all students, you probably know that Abraham Lincoln did not write the Gettysburg Address until he was on his way on the train. And, I feel like if Abraham Lincoln was here today, he probably would say, Kent, your speech is no Gettysburg Address. All right, well, let's get into it. Sorry for that long intro. First, to my fellow procrastinators, congratulations. It feels good, doesn't it? All right, back to your vacant stares. What are you thinking? I'm just gonna guess. I'm so happy I graduated, but now what am I gonna do with the rest of my life? Am I gonna get a good job? Do I even know what kind of job I wanna get? Are my friends gonna zoom ahead of me? How will I ever be able to score good weed again? If you're not asking these questions, I may not be useful to you. But for the rest of you, please listen. Because I come here today as a living testament to a life unplanned. I didn't start asking these angst questions. Let me raise this a little. Excuse me one moment. My neck was, getting a little crick in it. So I didn't graduate college asking these angst questions. I actually arrived at college asking them. For some reason, I was already preoccupied with just worry about what I was going to do with my life. And I came here as a transfer student from the University of Texas. I grew up in San Antonio. My parents met at the University of Texas. My brother went there before me, and I was happy to be there. But I still arrived with just such a tremendous sense of worry about what I was going to do. I felt like I was haunted by this demon of not having a direction in my life. And I remember when I met my freshman year roommate, I'll call him Phil. Actually, the reason I call him Phil is that is his name. Anyway, when I met him, he said, that he told me his whole plan, he wanted to be a pharmacist. And at that point, there were two things that I knew for sure. One was that I don't want to be a pharmacist. And the other was that even though Phil wants to be a pharmacist, I'm so envious of him because he knows what to do. And, I lived. When you walked into our dorm room, there was like an invisible line. And I'm going to let you guess which side everything was organized and ordered in 90-degree angles and which side had clothes on the floor. But before you get judgmental, they weren't haphazard. There was a clean pile and a dirty pile. It was organized. Anyway, Phil was a planner in everything he did. And, he every Sunday night, he would kind of map out his week. So he would plan his meals, his bedtimes, his wake-up times, his study times, even his party times, everything. Now, I'm not going to get graphic, take us into the gutter, but let's just say Phil was pretty anal. Phil was a planner. Anyway, he had a weekend job at a Howard Johnson's in Austin, but that didn't keep him from letting loose on Friday and Saturday nights. And he would drink 4 beers, he would listen to pedestrian rock music, but at midnight, at the strike of midnight, he would tuck in his shirt, he would put on his shoes, tie his laces, put on his tie, and lay down in bed and go to sleep. That's right, on top of the covers, Phil would sleep fully clothed. At 5:15 a.m., the alarm would go off, he would hop out of bed and zip out of the room, and he was never late. Me, on the other hand, I started my second year still an undeclared major. I met with my academic advisor, and I tried to convince him, well, why can't I just major in undecided? I wish I could tell you that I was making that up. Anyway, I was very committed to being uncommitted, and in my third year in Austin, rather than pick a major, I did what any privileged middle-class white kid might consider doing. I quit school. So after a series of construction jobs in Austin, I decided to re-enter school, and I transferred to the art school here at the University of Oregon. I had this romantic notion about Oregon, that its natural and diverse beauty, and I thought of it as a great frontier, which has really proven to be true, ahead of its time in so many ways. And a lot of that was fueled by a friend of mine who had come to summer school here and was just going on and on about how great it was, and he was correct. Anyway, my impulse to come here, and I came here sight unseen, by the way, it may have seemed foolish, but it turns out to be one of the best decisions of my life. I fell in love with everything about Oregon. The value that's put on nature. I mean, even I took rock climbing class for PE. Where else can you get college credit for rock climbing? I discovered yoga. I went camping all the time, and I learned how to say Oregon instead of Oregon. But most of all, that move really freed me up, to explore my desire to leave academia and be more creative. So I pretty much lived at Lawrence Hall, where I studied photography, design, printmaking, and subjects like journaling, to indulge my self-obsessed sense of self-importance. Anyway, it was really one of the first times that I actually challenged myself, and for the first time I couldn't stay up all night and cram for a test or write a paper. I really had to stay on top of it, and I got a good sense of self-discipline. And even though I didn't necessarily think that I would end up being a professional artist, I really took the work seriously. And I had some incredible teachers. Laverne Krause, who was from Oregon, amazing painter, and she, in some ways, as I took printmaking from her, but she was so concerned with us being critical thinkers as much or more than our printmaking technique. But of all the teachers, I had one teacher named Bob Costa who once proclaimed, "Perhaps the biggest risk one can take in life is to not take risk." And I really liked the sound of that when I heard it. I'll repeat it. Perhaps the biggest risk in life is to not take risk. And as I look back now, I really understand why it resonated with me, because it's true. It took me years to actually live that, especially because during the last year in school, my father unexpectedly died, and that threw me into a tailspin of withdrawal. Being back here brings back a lot of memories. Anyway, I felt like at that time I was obsessing about what to do with the beginning of my adult life when his ended. And if my anxiety about my life wasn't enough pressure, I now had the perfect excuse to retreat from it, and I did. In fact, I ended my U of O career with an incomplete, and today is the first time I've ever worn a cap and gown. to President Schill and Provost Coltrane, I reconciled the incomplete. We're all good. Anyway, during my time in Eugene, I held various odd jobs. I worked at an auto parts distributor, restocking their warehouse 3 nights a week. And I can't say that it had no implications on my life. To this day, I got so adept at driving a forklift, I can drive like a demon in reverse. I worked across the river in Springfield as an umpire in their adult community baseball league. I'm still not quite sure why those adults took me seriously. I ran an adventure playground program for kids. That was more peer-to-peer. But mostly I worked as a waiter. I recall my interview with Bruno Bolog, who had one of the few upscale restaurants in Eugene at the time. And he asked me about my experience, and I assured him I had a lot of restaurant experience. I didn't clarify that it was really more as a diner than a server. But he hired me, and it really was that job and then subsequent jobs for the next couple of years in Eugene and later when I moved to Portland that I realized was incredible preparation for me for what I do now, in fact. The mindset of hungry, entitled people in fancy restaurants is also a good way of describing a lot of the people I work with in Hollywood. Of course, I didn't realize that then, and I wasn't knowingly training myself. The truth is I was avoiding myself, and I put myself in kind of an extended state of delay. And after a couple of years of that, I did what perhaps any privileged middle-class white kid might do. I decided to go travel in Europe. So I made a modest amount of savings last an immodest amount of time before finally going to New York to really confront sort of commencing my career. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with the trials and tribulations of building what eventually did become my career, but after much hard work, I had identified a design firm that did a lot of work in New York with entertainment clients, and I had an allure to that. And I was really stimulated by their proximity to sort of film and television clients. But after a few, several years of that and many forgotten advertising campaigns, I really sort of increasingly felt the impulse to be involved in creating and developing and producing projects rather than coming in at the 11th hour to promote them. But I really didn't have a basis for knowing how to make a switch. So one time I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone, and I told him, that I was really just didn't think I could cope with it any longer. And he said, good. And I said, well, did you hear what I said? And he said, yeah. And I said, I'm telling you that I'm really starting to lose it. I think I'm going to have a breakdown. And he said, oh, that's great. And then he said, because that's when you're going to make a change. And I realized he was right. And I had probably been complaining for a while. I was in my mid-30s, and I was really right at the cusp of having the option to choose security for my life, but at the expense of fulfillment. And I knew I had to take a leap. And that quote, perhaps the biggest risk one can take in life is to not take risk. And it started to resonate. So I drew on some contacts that I'd been making in the field, and some offered hope, but I can't help but remember the head of a premium cable network, when I met with him, said, you're 35 years old. You're too old to enter the entertainment business. And fortunately, I ignored his advice, because not all advice is good advice. So I quit my job and I started working with some writer friends, just developing projects and pitching them around town. And sort of freelance by freelance project, I worked my way really to my first big break. And that was when I persuaded Michael Moore, the infamous documentary filmmaker, into hiring me as a segment producer on his show TV Nation. And I'm fearing that I'm going on too long, but I could tell you how that happened. Would that be okay? Yeah? Okay. So some friends of mine had given me a copy of the pilot that he made. It was a show that was going to NBC and BBC in England. And they didn't really know how to recommend me for it because I didn't have a real basis, but they thought it was up my alley in terms of sensibility. So I just kind of pretended like I knew what I was doing. I got the number of the production office, and I kind of conned my way into basically a meeting with Michael. And I pitched ideas for the show, and he was swayed enough that he had me meet with Kathleen, the show producer, and Jerry, who was the supervising producer. And I met with them, and they explained that one of the ideas that I had pitched, which was about how the Klan was reinventing themselves for the 90s to be a more politically correct hate group, he loved that story, and he had it on the board, but they weren't bringing in new filmmakers until they had 2 stories assigned. So this went on for week after week. I would go in, and I started to see how it was working, and they had assigned a researcher to start researching the Klan piece, but I still was not getting anywhere, and they were already had hired people, and I felt like the boat was leaving the harbor. So finally, I had this fear they were just going to kind of move on without me. So I decided to take matters in my own hands. And one Monday, I just showed up, and I went to Jerry, and I said, Kathleen said you need to give me a computer and a desk to start on the Klan piece. And then I went to Kathleen, and I said, oh, by the way, Jerry brought me in to officially start today on the Klan piece, and he said, I need to talk to you about getting a second story assigned. And it worked. They didn't check with each other. So I became official. The only complicating factor was then I had to do the job. But it was an incredible experience. I basically learned it the same way I learned what I did in the restaurant job, which was diving in and working my ass off. And I ended up learning so much about writing and directing and producing. And, it really has continued to serve me well through these years as I've kind of moved in between those disciplines and also being an executive in film and TV. So if you're sitting here today and you're wondering what is the way to get started on your career, I hate to break the news to you, but it really doesn't matter. There's no one path to anything. I've worked around so many people, and everyone has their own story, and no two are alike. There's no formula to it. You really, I think the great thing about experience is that no experience is invalid, and each one leads to the next. And you should never think of any job as your last job, unless you're tenured. But really, every job just leads you to the next opportunity, and you just have to put yourself in a position to be ready to seize those opportunities. And for me, the biggest obstacle that I really ever encountered was myself. And I fell into the trap of feeling like I needed to know my destination before I could really jump into the journey. And when I finally accepted that uncertainty is a de facto part of life and not something that you need to get over or overcome, I actually derived a certain amount of solace from that. And when I realized that that will always be with me, I embraced it. And it kind of freed me up. And I started living with more purpose, even if I couldn't necessarily define that purpose. Thank you. And to this day, I can tell you with complete conviction that every time I've made a choice to take a risk rather than security, my life has improved because of it. And if you really want liberation, here's the best advice I can give you. And it's so simple, and yet it's so challenging and difficult to practice, and that is live in the moment. When you obsess about the future, it sort of tends you towards anxiety, and when you really dwell on the past, it can really connect you to depression. And the truth is that there's no living in the future or the past. Neither are authentic experiences. The only real experience you can ever have is in the present. Just like we're having right now. And this really applies to every aspect of your life. And especially in this age, some people have acknowledged, of electronics and social media, and even the illusion of being connected. It's very easy, to sort of fall prey to the numbness and that illusion. And I just want to urge everybody, at the risk of sounding like an out-of-touch old man, I implore you to resist that temptation and go for real experience. In fact, there's nothing more rewarding in your life than making real connections with real people. I've been lucky enough to have been marry and create a family, and my wife Michelle and our daughter Evelyn and son Zeke are all three here today, and I couldn't be prouder of that. No job that I've ever had have I worked as hard, has it made me feel as accountable, and has ultimately been as rewarding as being a father. And for all of you who are lucky enough to have any parents with you here today, I hope that you will really embrace them. I know the pride that they feel for you might make you squirm a little bit. I saw some of the wacky ones on the parade on the way here. They're very excited, but guess what? They can be more helpful to you than anything that any of us up here can say today. And on a more macro level, I just want to acknowledge how auspicious it is that the class of 2016 is graduating in the same year that our nation has finally perfected the presidential election process. Just like our founding fathers imagined it, right? But actually, if you are smart and thoughtful, which everyone in here is, it's easy to despair about the crazy state of the world we're living in, especially in light of the all too frequent tragedies that have been happening. And it's very tempting to be cynical and withdraw and not engage. And I also urge you to resist that impulse. The greatest power we have is how we interact with people on a day-to-day basis. And it's very important to find and solicit and maintain whatever communities that you connect with. Nothing will brace you more from the hazards of the world, and conversely, nothing will help you affect change more than that. And finally, I'm going to leave you with some very good news. As you enter this anxious post-college time, you actually already possess the single most important asset that you will ever need in your life, and that is your point of view. And there's no one else on earth who has it. You're the only one, and it's one of the only things that no one can ever take away from you. And you have no idea how valuable it is. It's the greatest currency you'll ever have. It really, and it doesn't matter what field you're in, whether it's superficially creative or non-creative, it really doesn't matter. You should never tell anybody what you think they want to hear. That's not authentic, and it will never serve you, and it will never lead to good results, whether it's professional or personal. And sorry I'm sounding so preachy. All right, let me just boil it down. I'm not criticizing Phil for knowing that he wanted to be a pharmacist. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with pharmacists. We need them. And I'm not mocking him for mapping out his entire week before experiencing any of it. I mean, maybe a little bit about, going to bed fully clothed. But the important thing that I want to say is that it doesn't matter whether you know what you want to do or you don't know what you want to do. I'm just suggesting that no matter what you do, if you plan too much, you risk living too little. All right. So congratulations, graduating ducks. Go into the world as if you were taking to water. Choose risk, avoid complacency, embrace change, be present, always listen to yourself and others. And congratulations in advance for all of the rewards you will lead yourself to, even the newly enlightened pharmacist. Thank you so much for having me. Congratulations.
All right. Thank you, Kent.